Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Steve Ertel. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Communications and Marketing here at Vanderbilt. As you all have seen the last week or so, there's been a lot of conversation and discussion around the U.S. News rankings. There was a lot of volatility in this year's rankings as methodologies were changed. Many of which were of great concern to Vanderbilt and to other universities, particularly changes that included reducing measures of, pretty tried and true measures of academic excellence, as well as misuse of data and data sources that created a kind of an inaccurate picture of the affordability and access that universities like Vanderbilt provide. And so you've obviously seen several messages that we've put out on this, but we received a lot of questions from folks about the rankings, how they work, what really has changed this year, and why is this problematic. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Olivia Kew-Fickus, who is our Chief Data Officer at Vanderbilt. And she's going to walk through a presentation to share some of the details on that. But then we'll also have a question and answer session at the end where we can address any questions from you all. To send in a question, there's a Q&A function in the webinar. So please submit your questions throughout the conversation, and we will get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A portion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Olivia to take us through it.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. And I appreciate all of you making some time today to come to this webinar. My topic today is the mechanics of rankings. And my goal is to give you a little bit of an insight into how rankings work, what goes on really under the hood of these important, interesting publications. And this presentation that I have is a presentation that I have given. It's an updated version of a presentation I've given a number of times for an internal training program that we do called the Business of VU, which provides an overview of a lot of different aspects of running a university. And people are always fascinated whenever I give this presentation because I think there's a mystique, a mythology around rankings. And actually, when you get under the surface, you find out that it's a lot messier and a lot less objective than it appears to be. So where I'd like to start, and I usually do this whenever I'm talking about anything that derives from data, is to start not with the detail and down in the grain, but with a question around the purpose of rankings. Why do they exist at all? And if you talk to U.S. News, they will tell you that the rankings exist because they are there to help students and their advisors make the best decisions about colleges. In fact, they enjoy telling universities and colleges this whenever we talk to them about their ranking. They say, look, you're not our customers. The students are our customers. What they need drives us. And so I really want to just dig into a little bit of what that can look like, not by looking first at a college ranking, but by looking at a different ranking that U.S. News puts out. U.S. News has a lot of rankings, a whole stable of them. And one of their rankings is on cars and vehicles. And this is a ranking I actually used myself a number of years ago. I had lived overseas for many years. And when I came back to the U.S. about 5 years ago, I needed to buy a vehicle quickly. And if you haven't lived in a country for a while, you actually don't have a really good sense of what are the makes and models of what's available to you. So you've got to make a fairly complex and big ticket decision very quickly. And that's what the rankings often are purported to help you be able to do. And what you can see here is that with their car rankings, U.S. News doesn't even have a single kind of this is the best car in the country. Instead, what they do is immediately funnel you into what kind of car are you looking for? Because, of course, what car might be right for some people is not going to be right for other people. You may want an SUV, you may want an electric vehicle, you may want a hybrid. And so you can see they give you a lot of their first choices, start you down, what specific type of vehicle do you want? And they're really just trying to simplify what the rank, what it is that you, how do you make that decision? But with the college rankings, US News also plays to another reason that rankings are often just so popular. People like looking at them. They often make headlines in lots of different ways, not just around colleges. And that is because people really like a ranked, ordered list. And they like to know who's winning and who's losing. And I've put this kind of silly example up here because it really exemplifies that. What's the purpose of this list other than to make some people feel like they're winning and some people feel like they're losing? On what basis have they even decided? They had a survey, clearly. What basis have they decided, or have people decided that one state is better than another? It appears they were just asked which is better without any kind of guidance. And so what's come up is a ranking which a lot of people would dispute, and it's really there just as eye candy. And why is that eye candy piece important? Because really there's a third reason that rankings exist as well. And that is to drive eyeballs to websites. This is the actual picture of the US News car rankings website when I went to it. And I had to excise a portion of it to get it to fit onto the slide. But what you can see is there's a huge advertisement in the middle of it. Rankings are there as clickbait. They are there to make, to drive eyeballs to websites and to make money for the people who create them. And they don't necessarily always tell you a lot. So what is the purpose of rankings? This is just really a summary of what I've said. They simplify a complicated decision. They satisfy people's love of a competitive list. They're there to make money for publishers. They are already trying to do multiple things. There's already kind of a conceptual challenge as you get under the surface with rankings and why they exist. So then let's get into what you've probably come to this presentation for, which is what do you need to know about actually how the rankings work? And in this case, I want to start with an introduction for you to the whole rankings ecosystem, because US News is actually only one ranking among many that affect colleges. And what you can see on this slide is that there are quite a large number. This is just a selection of rankings that are targeted at domestic colleges. So this is about, what is going on in the US college environment. And then there is a whole nother set of rankings, many of which, if you're not in a role like mine, you may not know about, which are the international rankings. And this is rankings that purport to tell you what are the best colleges around the world, comparing across countries, not just within a country. And all of these rankings, if you look at the left side of your screen, the ones on the left are really kind of general rankings. They are trying to tell you these are the best colleges, whereas the ones on the right are often much more specialist or niche. So you can see, if you look at the top, you've got the free speech rankings, or you've got the Campus Pride LGBTQI friendly campus rankings, or the Sierra Club's rankings about sustainability. And so they will be ranking on for different purposes, trying to tell you different things about those colleges. But all of them fundamentally work in the same way. And to understand this slide, what I want you to think about is a teacher or an instructor's grade book. When you start the semester, your instructor tells you that maybe 20% of the class grade is going to be based on homework, and 30% is going to be based on a midterm exam, and then 50% is going to be based on whatever the final project or exam is. And so you know that you'll get usually something between 1 and 100 on something, and then it's multiplied by the weighting, and then those are added together to come up with whatever your overall grade is at the end of the semester. The rankings work exactly the same way. They take a series of metrics and they multiply them by a weighting. They add all of that together and come up with the overall score. Couple of really important things to note here. The elements that go into a ranking have to be quantifiable. They have to be things that can be turned into a number. And there has to be a distribution across those numbers for the different colleges, so they can't all come up with the same number. It's not a very useful element. The second thing is that they have to be available for all schools. And this is often a real challenge that you're saying, well, we might be interested in this, but not all schools have that metric available to us. And so you're really starting to say, okay, what's available? What can I get for all the schools that I want to rank? And of course, the data that goes into the ranking has a huge impact on the outcome that comes out. In addition, the other thing that you can play with if you're a rankings compiler is you can play with the weightings. And so adjusting the weighting will also have a significant impact on the ranking order as it comes out. So those are the kind of the pieces of a ranking that's what it's made up of. So now let's turn to what data US News uses. And this is a table that we've put together for our own internal purposes of what is the data that US News has put into what they call their 2024 edition, which is the edition that is currently on the street. It's for the 2024 high school graduates. And in here, what you see is you've got what's termed factors here. Those are those metrics I talked about on the previous slide. And then you've got a weighting. And those are multiplied together to come up with a ranking. It's as simple as that in many ways. We've talked a lot and you've heard a lot about that things have changed. That's why this has become a more of a discussion point this year. So what exactly has changed? First of all, US News themselves call this the most significant methodological change in the rankings history. And what you have in front of you is actually their own visualization of how their methodology has been made up over time, what weighting the different pieces have within the overall 100% methodology. And you can see the black arrow over on the far right-hand side, that is the 2024 methodology. And you can see how different that column looks from the previous columns on that slide. So let's dig back into our table a little bit more and think about what actually has changed between 23 and 24. And if you're a rankings compiler, you can change two things. You can change your metrics or you can change your weighting. And so in US News case, they have added some new metrics. All of those things that are in gold have been added. And we'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a minute. They also have taken a bunch of stuff out. And again, I'll go into those in more detail in a minute, but you can see they've taken out quite a large number of metrics. They have changed the weighting. And so you'll have worked out already that the weightings that are in red are the things that they have reduced a weighting on. The weightings that are in green, they have increased. And they've left just a couple of things exactly the same. What's called their peer assessment survey, which is a survey they send to senior leadership at colleges around the country, asking them, what do you think of all these other colleges? And they send them a list of over 400 colleges and ask them to rate them 1 to 5. And then also SAT and ACT grades, which I think are fairly self-explanatory. Those are the only things they've left the same. They've also made another really interesting change to this year's edition. Previously, US News had a very interesting relationship with colleges, whereby they actually sent us a survey each year and asked us to submit data to them. And by my reckoning, something like a third of the ranking was based, at least in part, on data we submitted to them. Much of it was either proprietary information that there was no other way to get it except by asking us. So things like class size and percentage of faculty with a terminal degree, those were both proprietary elements. Also alumni giving. And The rest of it was data that they wanted the most up-to-date information, and that it was not yet available. The most up-to-date numbers were often not available through public sources. This year, U.S. News has very publicly stated that they have pivoted so that all their data is available through public sources. We still sometimes can submit our most up-to-date information to them, and they will use it if they feel like it is valid. But most of their data is coming from public sources or is coming from something that they derived themselves. And the most significant addition in terms of, and change really here, is that they have started using this data source called College Scorecard. And it's interesting they started using it this year. College Scorecard's actually been around for quite a while, since the mid-teens. But U.S. News has never actually integrated it into their ranking in this year. And in part, it's because they had lost some other things because they could no longer get them from, they decided themselves they couldn't get them from the universities. And so they have instead decided to turn to this data source and integrate that. And what's the problem with College Scorecard? Pretty much everything on this slide, almost everything on this slide is actually going to come from College Scorecard's own website. And College Scorecard was created, as I said, in the mid-teens, and it was created by the Obama administration. And really the impetus for it was a very clear recognized problem that you had students graduating, or not graduating, but attending for-profit institutions, and leaving those institutions, sometimes with a qualification, sometimes without, but with large amounts of debt, and not really having boosted their earning power in any way. And so they were getting stuck with these debts that they couldn't pay off. And what you see is that College Scorecard, when they say they have pulled data that only includes Title IV receiving students, what that means is students who've received a federal grant or a federal loan. And so they say themselves, figures may not be representative of institutions with a low proportion of Title IV eligible students. So what percentage of institutions are Title IV eligible or Title IV receiving? This again is also from, it's a little bit old data, but it's from College Scorecard's website that I took down just last week. 54.5% of students nationally in higher education receive Title IV funding of some kind. So College Scorecard captures only slightly over half of all higher education students. You can see the percentages are higher at four-year institutions, 60% for public four-year, 65% for private four-year, and almost 78% for what's called proprietary, or that's those for-profit colleges I already talked about. But critically, there are some institutions like Vanderbilt where we actually, because we have dedicated such high percentages of money to financial aid, Scorecard only captures about 30 to 35% of Vanderbilt graduates in any given year. And many of those are individuals who are receiving Pell Grants, that is grants for lower income students, and not necessarily loans. Stated another way, data from College Scorecard, even across most institutions, four-year institutions, only includes, it excludes 1 out of every 3 of students from most four-year institutions. From an institution like Vanderbilt, it excludes 2 out of 3 of our graduates. So it's really not showing a representative group of our graduates. It is showing a very small group of our graduates, and not providing really reliable information about certain things. So let's go back to that list again. What is College Scorecard actually providing here? College Scorecard is providing information about, I'm going to go from the bottom, graduate earnings, so how much graduates make, and what they're specifically doing is comparing it to the amount that a median high school graduate earns. It's providing information about how much debt those students have, specifically from federal sources, but it's only asking about that for students who, most of them, have already borrowed money. It's not asking about the large percentage of students who have not borrowed money. And then it is also being used by U.S. News to add in for the first time some first generation metrics, which again, they themselves say are the first generation metrics only for first gen students who've already borrowed money. And it's interesting to compare this to what US News say themselves are what students' top priorities are. So if you come back to what US News say, the purpose of the rankings is to help advise students. And they say they've made these changes because they want to respond to what students say are the most important things for them. And this piece I've put in at the top actually comes from a webinar US News did just yesterday when they were talking about how their methodology, they felt, responded to this. So they say their students' top priorities are academic quality, affordability, and postgraduate outcomes. And yet the affordability and postgraduate outcomes information they've put in there is coming from this very fragmentary data source in many ways, which does not pick up a lot of graduates. And then some of the pieces they've taken out, as I mentioned before, things like class size and terminal degree, that is faculty who have a PhD or other final top degree in their field, so their qualifications for teaching and for engaging in research. Those are things they've taken out. They were, you can see those two add up to over 11% of the rankings. So those are some of the concerns that Vanderbilt has with respect to what some of the decisions that US News has made this year about their ranking. Why have they done this? Well, we come back to they need metrics that are available for everybody, and they need metrics that are quantifiable. And so they have to draw on what they can get hold of. If they decide they don't want to get hold of it from the institutions themselves, then they're basically creating, they're grabbing what they have on the shelf and creating something of a Rube Goldberg machine, which attempts to tell students how good a university is with data that's what's lying around. It's often been compiled for different purposes. Why does this matter? This matters because students do use US News, and there was a very interesting report that came out earlier in the month about how students use the rankings. And the good news is that students use the rankings less than they used to. Looks like about 22% of high school seniors report that they've been using US News, but it is still by some margin the most used of all those rankings. And the report indicated that students often use the rankings to help find what the lead there is called the right neighborhood. So they're trying to find where they should land, what's the range of colleges they should be looking at. And yet, US News this year, the changes they introduced to the ranking led to huge volatility. So 25% of the schools in the national colleges ranking that Vanderbilt's in moved by more than 30 places. That feels like that's moving out of a neighborhood. And 65% of the schools, so 2/3, moved by more than 10 places, which are also very significant moves. And you can see the American Council on Education here is really pointing to this volatility as evidence that the rankings are not really telling you anything about the colleges. These changes are not being driven by anything that's happened at those colleges. And they call into question not only where the rankings are now, but in fact, whether they've ever been reliable indicators of quality or guides for students, which is what US News says they're trying to do. So in short, they're putting an awful lot of weight. There's an awful lot of weight with rankings going on some pretty questionable foundations. And I've been focused here about US News because that is the topic of the moment, but there's a lot of other rankings. I'm not going to do a rundown of all of them. These are just some of the ones that we at Vanderbilt have tracked over the years, and trying to understand kind of why rankings look different from each other. What I wanted to draw your attention to here is two elements. The first is where it says postgraduate outcomes from college scorecard. You can see US News there it says 10%. There's actually another 5% coming from College Scorecard that US News has in it now. But Forbes and Wall Street Journal both have about 50% of their ranking, which is drawing from College Scorecard at this point. And the other thing that's interesting and that I personally am keeping an eye on is how many of these rankings use surveys. Wall Street Journal's just come out with a new ranking where it's just using 25% is based on a survey they do of tens of thousands, to be fair to them, of college students around the country. But when we look at, for instance, how many Vanderbilt students they've surveyed, it's about 200 to 300. We worked out it was about 4% of the Vanderbilt undergraduate population. Similar numbers for other schools, including those that are much bigger. And all I can say is that if I took numbers from a survey which had such a small response rate of our population to the provost, she would tell me that she was not willing to look at those numbers as being representative or telling her anything about what our students thought. So surveys, it's interesting. I expect it to grow, but it's a very difficult methodology to make work. So, in summary, what should you know about the rankings? First of all, they are created to drive eyeballs and clicks. And a point that I haven't made until this moment is there's very little accountability over any of those rankings. I can only assume that some of them, like Wall Street Journal, they are accountable to their editorial boards. But when you look at many rankings, there's only a handful of people behind them making the decisions about what's going on. A couple of people will be driving most of what happens. As I've already said, they're putting a lot of weight on some data that is fragmentary, that is, some of the data they use is fine. We use it actually for internal decision-making, things like graduation rates, but they are putting a lot of weight on data that is not data we would use for internal decision-making. And then a final point here, which is it really is important to me personally, is that I feel like they flatten the amazing diversity of higher education that we have in the US. We have a tremendous higher education ecosystem with lots of colleges that do lots of different things. And by boiling those colleges down to a standardized set of metrics that really only point to a portion of what they do, it really makes it hides from those applicants and those students trying to make a decision. What is the richness of what they could access? So I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up on a slightly lighter note. I mentioned earlier that there are some niche rankings, and this is my favorite niche ranking. This is the Campus Squirrel listings. And the Campus Squirrel listings look like a website from about 2005 because I think they are. They have not been refreshed on an annual basis. And in fact, they get around, they don't call themselves a ranking, and they get around the worst of the rankings because instead of ranking institutions from 1 to 100, they provide a rating or a grade for how good is this campus for squirrels. And 1 is the worst, 5 is the best. Vanderbilt University has been allocated a 4 squirrel rating. And all I can say to that is that if Vanderbilt squirrels are living only in a four squirrel world, I don't know what a 5 squirrel world looks like, but apparently it looks like Rice University. And so I will leave you with that observation and hand over to you all for some questions.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Extremely informative. We have a number of questions that have come in. I'll just remind folks that they can submit questions through the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. Before I get to the first question, I just wanted to kind of reiterate a few points that Olivia made. You know, one of the challenges for Vanderbilt with the fact that College Scorecard is being used is that it really doesn't count all the financial aid that Vanderbilt provides. So last year, Vanderbilt provided $244 million of financial aid, which meant that about 82% of our undergraduates didn't need loans because we have a need blind no loan financial aid system. So people who apply to Vanderbilt, we don't know what their need is when they apply. They get accepted, and then we evaluate need, and we provide full assistance. And so because of that, our students don't take out federal loans. So they don't take out federal loans, so therefore they're not counted in this particular ranking. And so I think that that's kind of where the rankings have always been problematic. You hear universities grumbling about them every year. We all have gotten caught up in that game. So you celebrate when it's good, you grumble when it's bad. But this year, the methodology changed so much, and it's really doing a disservice to particularly low income and first generation students who really do rely on the rankings to guide them on affordability. And so if they go on the US News website and they look at the average debt of a Vanderbilt graduate, it could be they could decide not to apply. And for us, that is kind of the biggest failure of the rankings, is that if those students are not applying because they think a Vanderbilt education is not affordable, they're a high achieving student in a low income area, that to us was worth speaking up on, because it really speaks to the mission of the University of Vanderbilt, which is high quality academics, but also a really robust and unique approach to financial aid that is pretty generous, and all thanks to our alumni, many of who are on this call, who have donated to the university to make that possible. So thanks again for that, Olivia. I'm going to kick it over to a couple of initial questions here. The first question is the recent US News ranking exclusively for undergraduate universities? And then how are graduate schools ranked?
So the recent US News ranking is indeed for undergraduate universities, but US News has a whole array of other rankings that they release through the year. They rank graduate schools, they rank professional schools, and they also, to their credit, actually, they rank they attempt to rank schools for different purposes. So they have what they call a best value ranking, most innovative, best for veterans, things like that. And I'm not going to delve into the methodologies of all of those. There was a lot of concern by the law schools back in the spring about the US News Law School ranking. And some of you may have seen when a number of law schools, including Yale Law and including Vanderbilt Law, decided no longer to submit data to US News. And in fact, it was that decision by the law schools to start boycotting the rankings, which was in part, I believe, behind US News deciding to switch some of their data sources out this year, because they wanted to make their rankings boycott proof. They did not want to be susceptible to the whims of universities deciding or not to participate. Steve, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Great. The question is, do the rankings take into consideration the job placement success rate of graduates?
This is an interesting question. They do not, is the short answer. If what you mean is how many of the graduates go on to get jobs or to go into further education that they want to go into, what percentage are successful versus what percentage are underemployed. They don't, for the simple reason that there is not an available data source for that. There is nowhere where that is collected at a national level. They are attempting this year to use the graduate earnings ratio as a proxy for that. So assuming that if people are successful getting jobs, then they will be earning at a level that enables them to be making more than a high school graduate. And so that is what they're trying to use as a proxy. But no, they are not using job placement success.
Thank you. Next question. Have these concerns been shared with US News and World Report? and what has been their response? And are there expectations that they will revise their criteria?
So U.S. News and World Report, the rankings team there, actually does have a cadence of meeting with institutions, and they were recently, back in June, they were at the Association of Institutional Research Conference in Cleveland, which is one of their major conferences for engaging with colleges. And Vanderbilt, we were there as well, and we engaged with them, met with them at that time. At that time, they were announcing that they were going to be changing their methodology, but they did not tell us what they were changing it to. And there were a couple of interesting meetings between U.S. News and the colleges at that point. Of various points were made to them, but they would not tell us what they were going to do. We did not know what their ranking methodology was actually going to be until they released the ranking to us under embargo on September 8th. And at that point, it was clear that they were not going to be changing the methodology this year. They would not change it on the basis of comments. They were asking us if there was any data that we thought was really wrong. But that was the only way that we would be able to have any impact on what they were doing before the ranking came out on September 8th. I believe it was September 18th. We continue to engage with U.S. News as we have for many years, both one-on-one and in various formats. As I said, they had a webinar yesterday that my team and I attended, but they always hold their cards very close to their chest, and I have never seen them make sweeping changes to the rankings on the basis of anything that we or others have put forward. They play their own hand. They sometimes will tweak things on the basis of some concerns that are put forward. I do not know what their plans are for next year. They are saying that they are not expecting to see such sweeping changes in the foreseeable future as that they've made this year.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come in about international rankings and a comment that the QS World University rankings came out this morning, and some questions about why Vanderbilt struggles a bit in the international rankings, and what we're trying to do about that.
It's a great question. Vanderbilt actually, what's interesting is you look across some of those domestic rankings, we actually are in a very stable place on those in the top 20 with most rankings, even though if you look at the universities around us, the colleges around us, they're very, very different in the domestic rankings. In the international rankings, we're all over the place. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but anywhere from about 70-something for the Shanghai Jiao Tong, we're 92nd in Times Higher Education. And then I haven't looked at the QS ranking for today, but we were 261st last year in QS. And a lot of this has to do with our domestic reputation versus our international reputation. We have a strong and growing domestic reputation, and we are now really turning our attention to international reputation because a huge portion of all of the international rankings, but especially QS, is on the basis of big reputation surveys, hundreds of thousands of surveys they send out each year, and that is a focus for Vanderbilt over the next few years, is to increase our reputation internationally, not to improve the rankings, but in order to increase our reputation internationally.
Great. Thanks. I actually have the pleasure of introducing Vanderbilt's Chancellor, Daniel Diermeier, who has joined the conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to say a few words, and then we'll keep the Q&A going and be able to direct some questions to Daniel as well.
Okay, Daniel. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Olivia, for this expert overview of the deep, dark art of the rankings and all the complexities that play a role here. And thank all of you for joining us today. So I first thought I wanted to highlight a couple of things and also give you a little bit better understanding for why we decided to really speak up on these issues. I think there's always, for years, there's always this issue with the rankings, and it's kind of like a circus, and it's like captures everybody's imagination, but you basically kind of move on. And that's not what we did this year. And the reason we didn't do it this year is really for two reasons. The first one is that we felt that this moving away from core metrics of academic excellence really constituted an attack on the very notion of what academic excellence is. And that was really the focus of our first message about a week ago. So the fact that we're not looking on whether our professors have doctoral degrees, that we're not looking at class size, that it, according to US News and World Report, makes no difference now whether whether your classes are 300 or whether you're doing small discussion classes. And sometimes class classes are appropriate, that's fine. But being able to have intense discussions and really engage with each other as part of a living learning community, we think these are important, crucial, important components of a great education. And to just basically see them eliminated, that was really concerning. And then the second piece, which is what we focused on this week, was really the question of access and affordability. And this is an important topic. It's very important. It's a very important value for us. So we have worked very hard in making a Vanderbilt education affordable. And just to highlight a couple of facts on that, we spend about $244 million each year on financial aid for our students to make Vanderbilt affordable for students from all backgrounds. That's, of course, part of our signature Opportunity Vanderbilt program, which is widely recognized for one of the really most generous financial aid programs. And what that does, what it means in practice, is that if you're a family that makes, let's say, less than $150,000 per year, you are coming to Vanderbilt is less expensive for lower income aspects. There's no tuition whatsoever. Than if you go to your local public universities and pay state tuition. And so that's an important thing. It's an important value for us that we really make Vanderbilt accessible and affordable. And the real worry that we've seen is that the way US News and World Report has been measuring access, despite all the rhetoric about social mobility, actually erects new barriers to access. And we just thought that this was so concerning that we had to point it out. And I'm just gonna want to just show this to you so that you can see it. You can see just the whole, the whole problems here, how problematic this is. And the last thing I'll say, this is personal for me. So I'm like I'm a first generation student. I'm the first of my family that graduated from high school. And, there are many barriers that first generation students have. And now adding misleading information to that is one step too much, at least the way I think about it. So let me describe what's going on here. So I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you are a family sitting around a dinner table, and the son and daughter is really excited about going to Vanderbilt. It's her dream school. And then dad or mom, they look at the US News and Reports rankings, maybe have the book in front of them. And then here's what they see. They see, you know what? I know you want to go to Vanderbilt, but look at this, they're like $30,000 in debt. We can't afford that. And then they go to another university that may be a much less good education, and with all the consequences that follow from that. So what you see here, this is what you find on the US News and World Report website. So it would have in the middle, this is the federal debt. And on the right side is all debts together, all loans. So people take private loans, those other loans that are not federal loans. So it's $30,000. So now let's look at what the reality is. Let's go to the next slide. So the problem with this number is that incredibly, US News and World Report looks only at the students that have taken out debt and then averages over that, wholly disregarding the fact that 83% of our students take no loans whatsoever. They're just ignored. So we're only averaging over those that have a positive loan balance. that's these bars, small bars here on the right. The 83.4% are ignored. And if we look at all knowns, if we go to the next slide, it looks just like that. Okay. So it gives a total. So if you're a low income, if my student now are sitting, if they're sitting at the dinner table, and let's say they're, they make $75,000 a year or $100,000 a year, right? And a little more than median income in the United States. They would that student would go to Vanderbilt for free and can graduate debt free. Okay, so that is really worrisome. So that student now is going to another university where they pay more, graduate with a higher level of debt, and have a worse education. That's what we mean by misleading. And we have pointed this out, as Olivia, I'm sure, mentioned before. We pointed this out to them repeatedly, and they just ignored us. And we know from the literature that especially low income and first generation students make what I just told you, this case. That's not a hypothetical case. There's considerably evidence for that. The people in the literature call this undermatching, meaning that high achieving low income students do not go to highly selective universities that will provide them with transformative education because they think that they can't afford it, even though it would be much less expensive to go to a Vanderbilt than to your local university. So we know this problem. We know that it has an impact on social mobility. And now the way US News Report is reporting, so to speak, debt levels, it creates additional barrier to access because it provides a completely misleading picture of indebtedness for universities such as Vanderbilt. That we find really worrisome, and that's why we feel we have a responsibility to speak out. So I'm going to pause now. We can take the slides down. I think we have time for a few more questions, right?
Yes. Thank you, Daniel. And actually, just kind of building off of that, as you were showing those slides, some questions came through about, is it possible that those slides are showing that the reason why students don't need loans is because they're wealthier? So I wondered if you might address that.
Yeah, of course. The answer is no. So it's a very interesting question. The question is, so what if you are, our policy is it's need blind and no loan. So they're designed so that you can graduate debt free. That's the whole idea. Sometimes families, because of their own financial situation, decide to take out a federal loan. So for example, they may have saved money for college, and now there is some extra expense that's coming up, and so it's just a very easy way to manage short-term cash flow by taking out a loan. You could take a loan a different way. That's the way it goes. And we know that the loan balances that you just saw, it's actually more higher income students are taking a higher loan balance than low income students. Okay, so it has nothing to do with that our financial aid is not generous enough. It has really to do with basically the personal finance of our students and their families. And so and remember, 85% of our students, or 84% of our students, have no loan balance whatsoever. So this is really more personal finance of how people manage their own financing, how they manage cash flow and so forth. We're not concerned about this in terms of affordability, and it is not. And the loan balances for higher income people are actually, the average loan balances are higher than for low income students. Good question, great question, and something we wanted to make sure, and so we looked at it.
Thanks, Daniel. A number of questions that have come in around, what Vanderbilt is doing to, and in addition to, I think, financial aid, what else is Vanderbilt doing to make the university accessible to attract low income, whether it's Pell or other low income students? If you might comment on that.
Sure. So, it's really important to understand that there are financial barriers to access and there are non-financial barriers to access. Financial barriers to access are just that. They're about affordability and access. And Opportunity Vanderbilt does a very good job of removing the financial barriers to access. I mean, we're top 6 or 7 in the country on that. We're very proud of that. And we've seen it making a difference because our number of low-income students, whether they're Pell Grant or first-generation students, have increased significantly. The other thing that happens are what's, are non-financial barriers. So what would that mean? The typical way in which this works is that families or students, either they think that they may not belong at Vanderbilt, or they may think they can't afford it. And the reason why this is important is that many low-income families or first generations, it's difficult to navigate the whole financial aid landscape. I mean, the federal form that you fill out, the FAFSA form, is already overwhelming. And so the problem is, how do we convince people that they belong at Vanderbilt and that the financial aid that we provide gives them a better education and a less expensive education than they could get in their local university? This is the key. So I'll give you one reason. We do this with respect to a variety of different student segments, and every student segment has their own challenges. So Hispanic students not Hispanic families, have another one from African Americans. One thing that we did recently are rural students. So rural students have significant barriers to access, even if financially they can afford it. And the reason is that they usually go to small schools where they may have been the only one ever for a long time that is considering going to Vanderbilt. They don't have as many AP classes, and they don't have the opportunity for as much extracurricular activities, which is things that we look at. So we just joined together with the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt University of Chicago, we're leading a program called STARS, S-T-A-R-S, which is specifically designed to help overcome these barriers for rural students. It was a very generous gift from Byron Trott, who and his family, who are very passionate about that. So this is like one student group at a time. Everyone has different challenges, and we're committed to removing these barriers for everyone, one at a time.
Great, thank you for addressing that. We have again several questions have come in around the theme, I'd say, of sort of what's next in terms of the rankings, right? Will Vanderbilt pull out of the rankings?
Yeah.
What are we going to do from here?
I think so. There's the question, but so we haven't made. We're evaluating this right now, and we haven't made a decision on that. I think the way I would think about it is this: pulling out or not pulling out is probably the wrong discussion. So, Columbia pulled out yesterday on the undergraduate ratings. The law schools pulled out. It's not, this is like, there's this old, like, voice and exit kind of thing, how when you try to have impact. And pulling out is one way to do this. And we're thinking about whether this is a good idea for us. But more important right now is, I would say, is to hold the rankings business accountable for the consequences of what they do. That to me is the most important thing right now, is that, whether we like it or not, family makes decisions based on the information they receive. We have not scrutinized that as a country, as higher education in general. And this year, it's so egregious that I think we have to do this. So the reason why we went into this is we wanted to hold them accountable. We wanted to have a debate on what are the criteria, why these criteria are used, and what the consequences of using these criteria are, especially for student access and for the choice that families. This is one of the biggest decisions that they make in their lives. So that's the focus right now. And people, there was some predictable responses. Oh, you're only doing it because you're dropped, or well, you're so wealthy anyway, and that's all fine, But it's important that we do not lose track of what's at stake. What's at stake is that we have students from all income backgrounds, but especially low-income first-generation students that use this information. And if the information is misleading, they're making wrong decisions. That's what we need to. That's our number one priority right now.
Great, and I'll throw out one final question, which again is sort of a summary of questions that have come in. We've had some really great questions coming in. And this is a little bit to do with, why now, right? So, and I think you just touched on this a little bit, Chancellor Diermeier, but, in the past, Vanderbilt has, celebrated its rise in the rankings, has had a steady climb for a while.
Yep.
And I think it kind of gets to the kind of sour grapes argument. Why now? If we had gone up in the rankings, would we have made such a strong case on this? So maybe just address that as and
it's a totally legitimate and great question.
Yeah.
Here's the way I would say it. When you drop in your rankings, right? You have to understand why. I think you have to know, because people will ask. They'll ask, so why did you drop in your rankings? And so what that means is that when you have an event like that, you look more closely, because you're going to have answer questions that you don't have to answer when nothing changes. So what we did, when we looked at it, is we found is that we had the best operating year in our history in terms of student demand, in terms of the quality of our incoming students, in terms of faculty research productivity, in terms of grants, in terms of fundraising, in terms of tech transfer, all record years. And so we said, whoa, what is that all about? And then we saw very quickly is that on all the criteria that were retained, we were either as good as we used to be or better. So what changed were the criteria. So we naturally ask ourselves, well, what's going on with the criteria? And what does it mean that this is the biggest, change in that? And then, so we looked very closely, and I looked very closely, and our team looked very closely, and Olivia and our team looked very closely, and what we found was shocking. Now, had nothing changed, had we looked at closely? That's a good question, okay? But the critical thing for us is that once we look closely, it was shocking, and the changes were much more dramatic and much more problematic than in prior years. Those are the two things I think that really drove us to take a position this year, even though we didn't do it before.
Great. Thanks again. So I think we're gonna close out the webinar. Thanks everybody for attending. Chancellor Diermeier, did you want to make any final remarks?
This is a complicated topic. There are people have kind of all sorts of points of view on that, but I have to say I'm haunted by this image of the family of they're sitting around the table, they have to watch every dollar. Their daughter wants to go to Vanderbilt, and then the dad says, honey, we can't do it because it's $30,000 in debt. And that student could have gone to Vanderbilt for free, could have had a transformative education with all the benefits that you have when you have a world-class education at Vanderbilt. And that student is now not getting this. And that is irresponsible. Okay. And so that's the image that I've been carrying around really for the last 10 days. And I just want to encourage you not to lose track of that. With all the complexity, with all the rhetoric, with all this and that, that's the key, is that families, high achieving students, irrespective of their financial background, have access to a world-class education. And because of misleading information, they're making decisions that makes that dream impossible. And thank you for caring, and thank you for participating today.
Great. Thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate your time, and we'll call it to a close.